Hello YouTube, this is Hunter Surge of the Brawler Cafe. Now, if you've been keeping up with the analysis vids, you've probably heard me say more than a few times disparaging comments about the flip card type. And as we move into the analysis of the full ability card pool, I'm going to be saying it a lot more. So before we dive into that, we are going to justify some opinions. Lay down why exactly I have that stance on flip cards. So, before we get into that, we need to break down what exactly are flip cards. Well, flip cards are a card type in Bakugan Battle Planet that will only activate when you take damage. When you take damage, you flip cards off the top of your deck. And when you have none left in your deck, you lose. You can take very easily high amounts of damage due to the team attack mechanics and some very powerful damage boosting cards if you ever get the chance to play them, but that's a subject for later. But it's very easy for high amounts of damage to come at your face. So flip cards are supposed to be able to stop that. Flip cards will have effects that activate when they are flipped, when you're taking damage. So let's get into what they do. So our first subset give you miscellaneous normal effects. There's a bunch of different types, but like within these five I've selected, we basically get all the different types of effects you'll see. We have drawing cards and stuff like Accelerate. Lava Flow gives you additional energy. This will only last until end of turn, so it's only really useful for playing more flips typically. Luck Aura will allow you to play a card from your hand for free. Photosynthesis and several other Ventus flips will allow you to energize stuff. And Shadow Breath will allow you to take control of an enemy hero. This is a super exclusive ability. Nothing else in the game has it. The same applies to Luck Aura. Well, Dan technically, but that doesn't play a card for free. Like, very, very exclusive club with those super rares. Not much else in the game does those sorts of effects. But the other effects you can get very easily in normal action cards. So we're going to get into this right away. The big problem with flip cards is twofold. One, they are dead draws in your hand. Now, the typical response is, oh, you can just energize them away. You only have one natural card advantage each turn. It is very, very bad for you to be dead. Like it creates very bad top deck situations, and the amount of flips that the game designers seem to intend you to play based on the starter sets is a whopping 10, which is a quarter of your deck. A quarter of your deck being dead draws is not very good. And the big problem with all of these is that basically most of these effects you can get in normal action cards that aren't going to be dead draws, and cards that you aren't going to need to reserve energy to be able to play. Sure, they do without a doubt plus you harder than normal action cards. But the RNG factors involved typically make these not worth it all, and these you want to avoid no matter what. Like, do not even touch these cards. Maybe Fading Dash, like that's the only one I make it sort of an exception for, but like stuff like Luck Aura and Shadow Breath are so unreliable with their huge high costs and the RNG factor and being dead draws that like you can't really build around them in any real way. And the other cards you can get on normal action cards, which, yes, they are going to minus you because you're spending a card from hand instead of doing the stuff for free. It's just not worth the dead draws. So moving on from that, we have the type that you are probably most familiar with, the normie stops that everyone gets. Every faction has basically these 5 stops. At 0 cost, you have 3 faction-specific stops. This will stop the remaining damage from an attack from a Bakugan of a specific faction that's listed on it. They cost no energy, but because of that specificity, they are very, very bad because you're basically never going to get them when you need them. These and the 1 cost are even dismissed entirely by the designers themselves. Like you can see in the most recent Brawl video on the official channel, when one of the players is taking damage and they only have 2 energy, they don't have the 3rd energy yet, they're going, oh, you don't have enough energy to play a flip, because everyone knows that these sorts of flips are super unreliable. Same applies, of course, to the 1 cost. The 1 cost will stop for 1 energy. Stop the factions that are not the original faction. So 1 of the 0 costs will always stop the faction that is. Will always stop the faction the card is of. Its 1 cost will stop the other 2 factions that it has stops for. Actually, no, this doesn't apply. I was going to say that most of these have been specifically for the factions that you will find them paired with on the Shield and Fist Monk, of course, but no, that isn't the case actually, as I can see right here. Not the case at all. Pirates has Darkness and Chaos. Wow, there goes that theory. Regardless, then we have the 3 costs. Block Outsiders. Okay, so we're going to be getting into this in more depth, but the 3 costs really super kills this. But we will be getting into that later, once we've established all this stuff. But Block Outsiders, keyword Outsiders are what these flips will always be called. They cost 3, and they will stop any remaining damage from all all factions that aren't the faction it's coming from. So that's how those work. Those are the ones that everyone gets. And then every faction has some special ones. These are definitely the best of the flips. So we have Rain Geyser, not this one, pretty bad. It doesn't actually stop any damage. You still draw the remaining cards. It will stop you from dying if you would have died from the hit. But this plus the max hand size of 7, like, bad card, very bad. Fear's Determination, Stand Together, Pact of Darkness, and Tiger Reflex. These are all the same thing. They are stops, just like the 3 cost Outsiders stops. That costs 4 instead. However, under their faction specific keyword, the card will be free. So Fear's Determination, if you have no cards in hand, it's free. Pact of Darkness, if you discard a card, it's free. Stand Together, if you have the most Bakugan cards, it's free. Tiger Reflex, if you have the most energy cards in play, it's free. So this should really go without saying, but Pact of Darkness, Tiger Reflex, and Stand Together are basically the big exceptions on basically every rule we're going to talk about when it comes to flips. Because while these are still dead draws, they are, when your strategy is going off, these are free. And Pact of Darkness is a big exception, like something I'd include in basically every Darkest deck, because you can always play this for free. You just, if you have literally a single card in your hand, oh, you can just play this for free if you don't have the energy, making it by far the best flip in the game. And then the last one I have here is Nature's Assimilation. I want to note this one because this is the one flip in the game that will stop an attack regardless of faction. There's also Black Hole and Darkest, but that doesn't actually stop an attack, and it actually hurts you more in the long run. So I did want to note Nature's Assimilation. Like in a super ramp deck, I could maybe see this being a thing, but it still has the issues of being live way late in the game. So yeah, that's a whole thing there. So let's get into the nitty gritty here. So what's the big problem? Well, the reliable flips that will stop damage all come at 3 costs or later. What this actually translates to is in battles where you're not just missing, which isn't what you should be running flips for, and it should be noted that there is a lot, like we've already seen multiple cards in set 2 that will allow you to reroll, so any standing issues become way less prevalent once that set hits. So the big problem here is games, even with flips, typically last 5 to 7 turns. So without ramping, you're only hitting about 7 energy. And for most of the game, you're well below that, like 5 or lower. And the attacks you really want to worry about are team attacks, because most attacks beyond that, outside of very specific aggro decks, are going to be aren't going to be big enough damage for you to really consistently get a flip off. When you're dealing with a team attack that's like 10, 15, maybe even 20 damage, you're going through so many cards, you'll probably see a flip. Even if you're only running 3 to 6, which are the free ones. The big problem here is this requires you to reserve 3 whole energy. The latest that team attack is going to be going off is turn 5. you're very likely going to have to deal with that situation on turn 5. What this means is when that team attack is coming down, you can only spend 2 energy that turn. And what this effectively translates into is, in order to keep these flips online, you have to not try to win the battle. This is obviously really not good. The 3 cost is just way too high. It forces you to go, okay, I'm not going to play the game. I'm not going to try to win. I'm not going to, like, if you make any attempt to win, you're sacrificing your ability to stop the attack, which is why those outsiders flips are so bad. The only ones that you can really depend on and still be able to play the game are the keyword ones, because you're going to be getting these ones off for free. You don't have to worry about their costs. You still have these big dead draws, but yeah. And the other problem is, of course, dead draws. So even with only 3 to 6, that is still like an 1/8 of our deck becoming dead draws, and we need to talk about something else. That something else is Evos. Evos are very important. You typically want to be running 3 of each of the Evos, 3 of each of your Bakugan's Evos, because the majority of Bakugan in the pool right now, most of their value comes from their evolutions. So if you do not have your Evos consistently, and your opponent is, you're going to be at a huge disadvantage. Now, why is this important for talking about dead draws? Well, every Evo that you draw after your first copy is a dead draw. Unless you charge it away, of course. So this means, by default, we're looking at 6 dead draws in your deck from the Evos. So if we're running, like, the more than the 6 I've been talking about, which is the highest I've seen any competitive player seriously talk about with flips. If you go any higher than that, you are looking at 1/3 of your deck being dead draws. That means, of course, this should be pretty obvious, but one out of every 3 of your draws is just going to be a dead card that you cannot use. Obviously, that's very bad. And creates for very bad late game situations, and it will lose you games. Like, just look at match videos of this game that have been uploaded by other channels where people are using flips. You will see a lot of people complaining about drawing into all their flips. I wonder why. It's because they're dead draws. They're completely useless in your hand. And I really feel that this is an area of the game where it's really been damaged by this whole design by MTG Pros thing. Because this is not a mechanic that is new. This type of mechanic exists in a lot of other games, but it does not exist in Magic, as far as I'm aware. None of my MTG friends have ever told me anything about such a mechanic in MTG, and I've never heard of it in MTG, so I'm pretty sure nothing like this exists in MTG, especially not as a core mechanic. Especially not as your primary way of stopping damage. So, what does this mechanic typically look like? Well, this is a mechanic that's like triggers in Vanguard, shields in Duel Masters, and several other games in Japan. Like, this is a type of mechanic that's very popular in Japanese TCGs. But the key difference is that those cards, those mechanics, always function in your hand. They aren't dead draws. In the case of shields, they will be cards that you pay for their normal cost for when they're broken as a shield. When you play them from your hand, you pay the normal cost, and when they're broken as a shield, you just play it for free. Triggers have different effects when they're flipped, and when they're in your hand, they are your most valuable defensive options for Vanguard. In Weiss, they're climaxes. I'm not too knowledgeable about Weiss, but I know that they serve a very similar purpose in Weiss. Climaxes, when they are damaged, they will stop the remaining damage. And they have normal effects as a card type while in your hand. Now, the key thing you do have to note about all of these is that in all of these games, you are limited to a specific number of these card types. So, I imagine they took, like, without really understanding what makes these mechanics work, took a look at that and decided, well, we don't want to restrict players that way. And while that's a nice thing to do, and I'm real glad they did, because I didn't want, if I was forced to play 10 flips, that would be awful. But you went a very, very bad direction with making sure you don't break the game by making this sort of mechanic unlimited. It feels bad to have flips. It feels bad because you're running these cards that are just dead in your hand, and you're in scenarios when you're in fights and you're like, well, I could play cards here, but if I do and I lose, well, now I can't stop the damage, and that sucks. That feels bad. That is not a rewarding gameplay experience. That's the big problem. There is a very simple solution to this. Let me be perfectly honest. The solution is just make flips more affordable. Step one, make flips inexpensive, like 1 or 2 costs at most. Maybe higher costs for some more valuable effects, but they need to be affordable so that we don't feel like we can't play the game if we want to keep access to our flips. And secondly, it is very, very, very important in my opinion that these flips are given alternate effects in the hand. This is the biggest thing you can do to fix flips as a gameplay mechanic, because it's very obvious that they intend flips to be a core part of the game, so they're not just going to go away, and they're probably going, if they don't take off, maybe they'll just push higher damage to try and force us to use flips, which would suck. And the way that flips as they currently are would force players to, again, not really play the game if they want to avoid taking damage, is not great design. But yeah, the best way to fix this is really give them lower costs, maybe give all of the ones that you want people to play alternate costs like Pact of Darkness, so that they can be made like just a non-energy way of using the card. Might be the best way to handle it. I'm honestly having a hard time thinking of many beyond just discarding cards, and that's obviously a very darkest thing, but I'm sure you can think of something. I'm sure you can think of something, Spin Master. And giving them alternate effects in the hand. Now, the important thing with giving alternate effects that you can use from the hand is that these effects would need to be below the expected value for their energy costs. However, and that's important to keep these things balanced, because if they're just as good as normal cards, then you're just going to fill your whole deck with flips. But if you do this, then you don't have this issue where you're running flips is now forcing you to run a bunch of dead draws, cards that like you're never going to have a use for them in the hand. And an energized mechanic does not fix that. You don't see dead draws being played in main decks of games like Buddy Fight. You don't see that happening in Duel Masters. I'm not sure so much about Weiss, but I know they have a similar mechanic. But yeah, it's not great. It's not a great state of affairs. Was there anything else I want to say? Well, if Spin Master watches this and they realize that there's a mistake, which I highly doubt, because the stance of official Spin Master employees regarding the competitive community's opinions on flips has been very condescending, I'll put it that way. Very passive-aggressive. Very unprofessional, if I'm going to be perfectly honest. So I'm not expecting any sort of change, to be perfectly honest, until maybe tournament results prove players aren't really playing flips, or something like that. And if they already realize this problem and it's going to be fixed within the next couple sets, which I highly doubt, why are you acting passive-aggressive about it? That's the real question. But yeah, I think that is going to be, I think I covered everything that I really need to. Right, the other thing. How am I supposed to stop damage? Well, there's this simple concept. If you're not running flips, you have a lot more usable cards, or if you're just running the good flips. Like, as I said, flips as a whole are not bad, but the general design of flips are bad. The generic flips are bad. There are only a few specific flips that are of any worth, and those are a Pact of Darkness, basically always run it if you're running Darkest. Tiger Reflex is great in any ramp deck, especially with Trox Ultra. If you can get that going consistently, that's pretty great. It allows you to take some hits, especially. And Tiger Reflex and Stand Together are good specifically in decks that that are revolved around those mechanics. Pact of Darkness you can just throw on anything because, hey, it's live always. But Tiger Reflex and Stand Together need more specific decks to be really played in. But yeah, those are the good flips. But for stopping damage in general, like if you want to do that, just run Ventus or Darkest. If that's the sort of thing that you want in your deck, it's as simple as running Ventus or Darkest, because those two factions have fantastic, in addition to having two of the good flips, they have a bunch of reduced damage rating cards that you can use. And if you don't have flips, if you have a small amount of flips, that means, of course, that you have more usable cards, and that makes it easier for you to win battles. Hyper-aggressive decks, even if flips were good, probably wouldn't be running flips anyways, because you really don't want dead draws in a hyper-aggressive deck, especially if it's Fury-based, because you need to be able to get everything out of your hand if you're Fury. Yeah, and like dead draws like that are just even worse when it comes to a hyper-aggressive deck, because you need to be winning early and taking advantage of that early game, and you can't really afford this situation where you're drawing into these completely useless cards. The evos that you're going to have to run are already bad enough, especially since you're going to need 3 of each in these aggro decks, because you need to be able to see those evos early and be able to see them on time for your deck to be able to properly function. But I think that's all. This was a bit scattered, not as structured as I wanted it to be, but let it be known that when I say flips are bad, I am not talking about all flips. I am talking about most flips. Probably your favorite flip too. But if it's Pact of Darkness, it's a good boy and I approve of it. Yeah, I think that's going to be it. Yeah. I'm not an expert in card design, but I've played enough card games to get a general feel of how this mechanic is supposed to work. And feels bad mechanics like this are not the sign of a fantastically designed game. This is probably my biggest problem with the card game design of this game. There's a few things that in the complete rules I take big issue with. I think conflict super hard with the card design and are just because of aping MTG, but whatever. That's going to be it. We are going to be diving into the Aquos ability cards either later this week or the start of next week. So look forward to that. And this is Hunter Surge signing off.